to talk about President Kennedy and civil rights, and I think the thing you need to know, I don't think you necessarily have to write it down, is probably the most troublesome topic that President Kennedy dealt with during his short time during his administration was that of civil rights. Okay, again, probably the most troublesome topic for President Kennedy during his administration was civil rights. Now let's kind of go back and just review before we write things down. You should know this. Civil rights really was brought back more than the 1950s. We had Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which desegregated all public schools, which some states abided by and some said pound sand. We'll talk about that later. We had the courageous stand in Montgomery, Alabama by Rosa Parks, who refused to give her bus seat up to a white man. She got arrested. That also began a struggle and a fight for civil rights. Those two events allowed a person by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. to be the leading spokesman for the civil rights movement in America, and he will continue to be the leading spokesman until his assassination in April of 1968. And he will go through some bumps and bruises along the way. His nonviolent approach to protesting civil rights will be challenged by those young radical blacks who are tired of being kicked and spit at and shot fire hoses at, and they're going to want a more radical approach, and he's going to fight through that. But we go back to 1957 and Martin Luther King Jr., and he was very concerned about the establishment, which is on your ID sheet, of Jim Crow laws. He was very concerned about the establishment of Jim Crow laws in the United States. And these were legal laws that discriminated against Negroes. So when you talk about Jim Crow laws, they are legally discriminating against Negroes. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of Jim Crow laws. We have some right in here in the room. Anybody want to look around the room and tell me an example of a Jim Crow law? Absolutely. Colored entrance only. Drinking fountain for colored and white. So if Negroes are forced by law to use separate entrances and separate drinking fountains and separate restrooms, those are examples of Jim Crow laws. Laws that are legal and enforced that are discriminatory. So our first example of Jim Crow laws are just what you see here. Colored entrance only. Drinking fountain. White, colored. Also you have those that have separate restrooms, white and colored. Those types of laws that are legal laws are called Jim Crow laws. Another example of Jim Crow laws we've talked about, if a hotel or a restaurant bans Negroes from coming into their establishment, legally if they come in, can they be arrested? Yes, because that's the law. So hotels had the legal right at one time to say, only whites here. I talked about Vince Lombardi, who was looking for hotel rooms for members of the Green Bay Packers in the 1960s, and lots of times the black players had to stay in a separate hotel than the white players. And I'll guarantee you that the black hotel wasn't near as nice as the white one, not even close. Remember, Vince Lombardi went into a restaurant during a road trip, and he said to the owner, "You serve Negroes here?" And his answer was, "Yes." "How would you like them cooked?" I mean, that's kind of what they faced. That's an example of Jim Crow laws, where restaurants and establishments like hotels could say whites only, legally. Okay? And absolutely what Rosa Parks did, it was a law that Negroes had to sit in the back of the buses, and if they ever got a seat and a white person came by and said, "Hey, I want your seat," you had to give it to them. That was a law, obviously, because Rosa Parks was arrested and fined, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott. And in 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. was saying, wait a minute, these Jim Crow laws are not right. Even though they're legal, they're discriminating against Negroes. And that became his crusade. And as a result of that, he established, this is very important to understand, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As a result of these Jim Crow laws and the discrimination against Negroes, in the 1950s, Martin Luther King Jr. established something called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We know it better as the SCLC. And what the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was, it was a civil rights organization based in Atlanta, Georgia. Okay? And the purpose of the SCLC was to plan peaceful protests against segregation and discrimination of Negroes. That was the whole purpose. So in 1957, because of these Jim Crow laws, Martin Luther King Jr. established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he was the head of it. The SCLC, as it's better known, was simply a civil rights organization based in Atlanta, Georgia, that was established to plan peaceful demonstrations throughout the 1960s, and you'll get examples, to end both segregation and discrimination among Americans. Some of the men that helped him establish that, right here, Ralph Abernathy, a picture of him standing right in front of the SCLC headquarters in Atlanta. This fellow right here, signed baseball, Andrew Young. Andrew Young was another person that was one of the first to volunteer and help Martin Luther King Jr. with the SCLC. Another one was a fellow by the name of Fred Shutterworth. Fred Shutterworth. And another one was Bayard Rustin, who in a preview will be the man that will be given the job to organize the famous March on Washington in 1963, in which Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech. So the first, what they called them, was sergeants under Martin Luther King Jr. that established this SCLC were people like Ralph Abernathy and Andrew Young and Fred Shuttersworth and Bayard Rustin. These were fellows that worked under Martin Luther King from the start to make sure that this Southern Christian Leadership Conference planned many peaceful demonstrations to try to end both segregation and discrimination in the United States. Now, I'm going to get on my religious soapbox for just a minute. To better know Martin Luther King's philosophy, we go back to one of the most famous sermons he ever made as a pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. This happened in 1957. He's a young pastor, and he gives this unbelievably famous sermon. And the sermon was called, Love Your Enemies. Love Your Enemies. And we're going to really talk about this. I think it's important, not only for this class, but maybe for you in life. Now, did Dr. King have many enemies in his life? Oh my God. Everybody that was discriminating against Negroes hated his guts. He was assassinated over this whole thing. He had lots of enemies, and he knew about it. So his point was in this sermon that you have to be able to love your enemies. And I'm going to tell you the 3 steps that he gave in his sermon on how you do that. All of us in here have people we don't like, maybe enemies, so maybe this sermon will hit home a little bit on how you deal. High school kids have all kinds of drama, so maybe this would help you deal with that a little bit. I think this is so unbelievable. Okay, the topic of King's sermon was love your enemies, because he had plenty of them. And here were the 3 steps he said that you had to take to love your enemies. Number 1, look at yourself and ask the question, why do I have enemies? Look at yourself and ask the question, why do I have enemies? Look at yourself and ask the question, why do I have enemies? Now I'm going to give you a life lesson here that kind of deals with this. I have served as a teacher, didn't get a lot of criticism as a teacher. Served as an assistant principal, got a lot of criticism as assistant principal. Served as a principal, got a lot of criticism as a principal. Served as a superintendent, got a lot of criticism as a superintendent. And served as a coach, where I probably got the most criticism in my life. You get frustrated, you get mad, you get hateful. One day I was watching Lou Holtz, who was the head football coach at Notre Dame, in an interview. And he talked about being criticized. I want you really to take this in. And he said, and ever since I've been 20 29 or 30 years old, I've lived by this creed after listening to this interview. He said, when you're being criticized, the first thing you do is you look at the person that's criticizing. I think you need to hear this. And if you have no respect for the person that's criticizing you, you simply ignore it. Why would you lose sleep over it? You don't have any respect for the person. That's a lot of problem that kids your age have. Somebody will talk behind your back or talk S about you or whatever. And you've got to look at the person that you're upset about and say, do they matter? Do I have any respect for that person? If you don't have any respect for the person criticizing you, you don't pay attention. You move on. It doesn't matter. Right? Mind over matter. I don't mind because you don't matter. Okay? Now, here's the flip side of that. If McKenna says to me in a critical way, Mr. Durr, I really think that you talk too fast in class and I can't keep up with the notes. Now, I look at McKenna and I respect McKenna. Okay? And so I have to look at her criticism and then decide if she has a point. If I don't think that I talk too fast, that I think that she needs to get on the ball, then we simply agree to disagree. But, and we're still colleagues because I respect her, but if I listen to what she says and said, you know, I think McKenna has a point, I think I do talk too fast and these kids can't get these notes, then I have to change. That's what Lou Holtz taught me. If somebody criticizes you, you look at the person criticizing you. If you have no respect for that person, you ignore it and you move on. Mind over matter. I don't mind because you don't matter, right? But if you respect the person criticizing you, you have to look at the criticism and decide, is the person legitimate in their complaint or are they not legitimate? We'll either agree to disagree or I'll say, you know, McKenna, you got a point. I'm going to have to change. Does that make sense? Now, when you go back to Martin Luther King, he's stating, why do I have enemies? Do I have enemies because I really am doing something that's not right? If that's true, then I need to change. But if I have enemies because I'm doing something that I believe in my heart is right, I got to agree to disagree. So you got to look at why you have enemies. Maybe it's your fault you have enemies, and maybe it's not your fault you have enemies, and you have to decide which way it is. Does that make sense? I think that's a good lesson. So that's the first step that Martin Luther King emphasized in how to love your enemies. Number 2, find an element of good in your enemies. Find an element of good in your enemies. Now this is more from a religious perspective when he says, find an element of good in your enemies. He's a pastor, he's a religious man. He believes that everybody was made in the image of God, right? So everybody's got to have something good about them. Might be only this much in your mind, but instead of concentrating on your enemies, the things that are bad, find something good about your enemy and emphasize that so you're not hateful. Does that make sense? You know, gee whiz, that Mackenzie's got a lot of faults, but man, every time she leaves here, she says thank you, and so I like that. I'm just making this up. Mackenzie's got like a 47% average in here. She doesn't pay attention in class. As a matter of fact, she's kind of a pain. She doesn't take any notes. But it's weird. Every time she goes out of class every day, she says, well, thanks, Mr. Durr, good lecture. That's what I'm going to concentrate on rather than the fact that, that's not true, you know, but that she doesn't take any notes and she has a 47%. Does that make sense? Find the good in your enemy, not the bad. Now, this ties in so much with what we heard yesterday about George H.W. Bush. The third thing, when you have the opportunity to defeat or ridicule your enemy, refrain from doing so. When you have the ability to defeat, humiliate, or talk down, so to speak, at your enemy, refrain from doing so. When you have a chance to embarrass, if you have a chance to defeat, if you have a chance to rub it in their face, if you have a chance to get even, don't do it. What did George Bush do when communism fell? Instead of standing on top of the Berlin Wall going, yeah, look at us, tear that baby down. Instead of saying, yeah, that Gorbachev's a real dandy, isn't he? God, yeah, we kicked butt on communism. Instead of gloating, he made the decision to work with Gorbachev and communism to try to get him to do things the right way. So King stressed in his sermon, there'll be always opportunities to pay back your enemies. Instead of paying back your enemy, forgive them for what they did. Forgive Gorbachev and communism. Help them get better. I think that's a perfect example of what we saw yesterday. Don't stick it to your enemy and gloat. Refrain from doing that. Be the bigger person. Now, that's how he said you dealt with loving your enemies. But there were 3 areas that he was really concerned with as far as that went. And that was in the areas of violence, the areas of hate, and the areas of love. And what I'm going to do is tell you what Dr. King suggested we do in each of those areas so we can love our enemies. What do we do in the area of violence so we can love our enemies? What do we do in the area of hate so we can love our enemies? What do we do in the area of love so we can love our enemies? Let's start with violence. And this is what he said. This is a great example. He said, concerning violence, someone has to, quote, dim the lights on violence. Somebody has to dim the lights in violence. I'll tell you about the Don Durr story. This is just exactly what he's talking about. Someone's got to dim the lights in violence. So I can remember when I was a little kid, we're driving down the road and somebody has their brights on, accidentally or on purpose. You know, when you're driving down the road at night, and my dad, that guy's got his brights on. Man, he sticks his brights on. And the other guy either doesn't turn his brights off, or he turns it off, and my dad says, well, I'll be damned if I'm going to do that, because he did it first. And then the other guy turns his on. And pretty soon, you got 2 people driving at each other with their brights on, which is going to cause an accident. And here's the point that Martin Luther King makes. 2 cars coming at each other, both with their bright lights on. Neither driver can see. Both are too stubborn to turn off their brights. It's going to cause a major collision. Somebody's got to come to their senses and dim their lights. Somebody's got to back down. That's the only way violence is going to go away. More violence creates more violence. Somebody's got to dim their lights. Somebody's got to take the high road. Does that make sense? And that's what he said. So violence, Dr. King stated that someone must dim the lights. 2 cars coming at each other, both have their bright lights on. Neither driver can see, but they're both too stubborn to dim their lights first. There's an accident, there's a collision, somebody dies. Somebody has to dim their lights if violence is going to go away. That was his point. Hate. Now listen to this, because this is so true. Hate distorts the personality of the hater. I'm going to give you a perfect example of my wife and I's discussion on this Sunday. Hate distorts the personality of the hater. I'm watching TV the other day. It's about 9:30, 10 o'clock. Fantasy football projections are up. I find out Melvin Gordon is not playing, my best player, because of injury. And then I find out my second best player, Kareem Hunt's kicked out of the league for domestic violence. I mean, and I am just going crazy. And then during the game, I'm so mad because my guy runs the ball all the way to the 1-yard line, and then the quarterback sneaks it in, and I get no points. And I am just going crazy. My wife says, "Who are you? I don't even know you on Sundays. You're not even the same person. You hate so much during fantasy football." Seriously, I get so mad at fantasy football because of my things. My things never go my way. My guy never scores. My God, my wife says, "Who are you?"
That and you were wearing a first shirt.
Well, that's true. "Who are you?" She said, "Your personality changes when you get so mad at fantasy football." And that's true. I got to quit playing. She's not going to let me play next year. But the point is, when you hate so much, you aren't you. You do and say things you wouldn't when you hate. And the second point he makes is he believes that hate distorts the personality of the hater. If a person hates, you hate yourself, and you're not the same person. So hate only causes a change in the personality of the hater. The hate changes who you are. Have you ever been really mad and hated something and just said or did something? When I was a young guy, and I still do it once in a while, give some of the greatest speeches I've ever given that I lived to regret. Well, I stuck it to Mackenzie when I yelled at her the other day because I was so mad. I should have waited and cooled down before I confronted her, but no, I'm going to give my shot in. And man, I won the battle, but I lost the war. Done that a million times. Whenever you're angry, whenever you hate, you've got to take many breaths and make decisions after you calm down because it distorts your personality. The last one's kind of interesting. Love. Okay? Dr. King preached that love has a transforming power. Love has a transforming power. We heard this today in the Bush interview. When the lady asked, what did your father say to you that meant the most to you when you became president? What did he tell him? I love you. You know, no, we don't tell people that enough. You know what? I tell you kids that. I love you kids. You know, and you're my whole life. This is my whole career, okay? So if Andy has a bad day, boy or girl, and I keep him after class, say, hey man, I love you. Does he feel better or worse about the day when he walks out the door? Hopefully, he feels better. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. I think we're so weird. We just don't like to show emotion. You know, my father, and I know my father loved me a ton, but he grew up in an area. My dad never told me he loved me one time in his life. Not one time. That wasn't what you did in those days as a man. You know what I'm saying? I think you look at my generation, I'm sure your fathers are different. I think it'd be easier for a father to tell his daughter that he loves her, maybe than it would be the son. I don't know. But in those days, the fathers, and you know, in my generation, very seldom told the daughter that they loved him. It's a missing link. And what Martin Luther King was saying back in 1957 is love has transformative power. It's a special power. Go up to the person you hate, somebody that just you can't stand, say, you know, despite all our differences, I love you.